power, passion, betrayal.
These three words define the extraordinary life of Mark Antony, one of ancient Rome's most charismatic and controversial figures. A man whose name is forever intertwined with that of Cleopatra, the legendary Queen of Egypt. But who was Mark Antony beyond the love affair? Was he a fearless warrior or a reckless opportunist? A brilliant strategist or a man blinded by desire? His story is not just one of romance. It is a tale of ambition, political intrigue, and a battle for the very soul of Rome. Imagine the chaos. The Republic is crumbling, Rome is divided, and the greatest military leaders of the time, Julius Caesar, Octavian, and Antony himself, are all vying for dominance. In the midst of this power struggle, Antony makes a decision that will change history forever. He allies himself with Cleopatra. Was this a masterstroke of diplomacy, or the beginning of his downfall? As we journey through his life, from his rise as a trusted general of Julius Caesar to his tragic end, we'll uncover the truth behind the man who dared to challenge Rome itself. But in the end, one question remains. Did Mark Antony lose everything because of love, or was he simply a victim of his own ambition? Stay with us as we unravel the untold story of Mark Antony, the warrior, the lover, the legend. Mark Antony was born in 83 BCE into one of Rome's most influential yet troubled families. His father, Marcus Antonius Creticus, was a military commander whose failed campaigns left a stain on the family's name. His mother, Julia, was a distant relative of Julius Caesar, a connection that would later shape Antony's destiny. But Antony's early years were anything but privileged. His father's disgrace and early death left the family struggling, and young Antony grew up in a Rome filled with political chaos, violence, and shifting alliances. Unlike other aristocrats who were trained in diplomacy and philosophy, Antony embraced a different path, one of action, ambition, and military skill. As a teenager, he fell under the influence of Publius Clodius Pulcher, a notorious populist and troublemaker. Together, they roamed the streets of Rome, living a reckless life of gambling, drinking, and debt. It was a dangerous lifestyle, one that could have ruined his future, but Antony's natural charisma and strength set him apart. People followed him, even then. Realizing he needed discipline, Antony left Rome and joined the military in 57 BCE, serving in Syria. Here, his true talents emerged. He wasn't just another Roman noble, he was a born warrior. His courage in battle, leadership skills, and ability to inspire loyalty made him stand out. Under Aulus Gabinius, Antony fought in Egypt and Judea, showing ruthless efficiency in battle. This was where he first encountered Egypt, a land that would later define his fate. By the time he returned to Rome, Antony was no longer the reckless youth of his past. He was a hardened soldier, a man with a purpose. And soon, fate would introduce him to the one figure who could shape his destiny more than any other, Julius Caesar. But was Antony ready for the dangerous game of Roman politics? Or would his warrior instincts lead him down a path of destruction? Up next, Antony's meteoric rise and his bond with Caesar, the alliance that changed everything. Mark Antony's rise to power wasn't just a matter of luck, it was a perfect storm of timing, ambition, and an unbreakable alliance with the most powerful man in Rome, Julius Caesar. When Antony returned from his military campaigns, Rome was on the brink of civil war. Corruption ran deep, the Senate was divided, and Caesar, fresh from his conquests in Gaul, was becoming an unstoppable force. Antony, with his battlefield experience and natural charisma, quickly caught Caesar's attention. The two men shared the same vision: power must belong to the strong, not the scheming politicians in the Senate. Antony became one of Caesar's most trusted allies, serving as his right-hand man in both politics and war. He played a key role in Caesar's rise, using his fiery speeches to rally the people, intimidating enemies, and making sure Caesar's interests were always protected. His loyalty was rewarded. He was appointed tribune of the plebs in 49 BCE, giving him immense influence over Rome's laws and citizens. Then came the moment that would define everything. The Senate, led by Pompey and his allies, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a direct challenge, a move meant to strip Caesar of his power. Antony, standing in the Senate, vetoed the decree. The room exploded in chaos. His enemies turned on him, and before he could be arrested, he fled Rome in disguise, riding straight to Caesar's camp. That night, as Caesar listened to Antony's report, A decision was made that would shake the world. Caesar would march on Rome. The Rubicon was crossed, the civil war had begun, and Antony was at the heart of it all. Throughout the war, Antony was more than just a commander. He was Caesar's most trusted enforcer. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar defeated Pompey, Antony led the left flank, holding the line against overwhelming forces. When Caesar chased Pompey to Egypt, Antony was left in charge of Italy, effectively ruling Rome in Caesar's name. But absolute power breeds enemies. Even as Caesar returned victorious, whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Antony, always the loyal soldier, stood by Caesar's side. But he never saw the dagger coming. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, as Caesar was stabbed to death by senators, including his own friend Brutus, Antony was left reeling. His mentor, his ally, the man who had shaped his destiny, was gone. Now, everything had changed. Rome was up for grabs. And Antony had to decide, would he avenge Caesar or seize power for himself? A deadly rivalry, an alliance with Cleopatra, and a battle that would determine the fate of Rome. The assassination of Julius Caesar threw Rome into chaos. The streets filled with angry mobs, senators hid in fear, and power hung in the balance. Mark Antony, the man closest to Caesar, was now at a crossroads. Would he strike back immediately, or play the long game? Antony knew that vengeance required strategy. Instead of launching an all-out attack on the assassins, he put on a mask of diplomacy. He allowed Brutus and Cassius, the lead conspirators, to believe he sought peace. But behind the scenes, he was rallying Caesar's supporters, preparing for the moment when Rome would demand justice. Then came Caesar's funeral. Antony took the stage, holding Caesar's bloodied toga before the crowd. His speech started calm, measured, then it ignited into fury. He read Caesar's will, revealing that the fallen leader had left money and land to the Roman people. The crowd turned into a violent mob. Brutus and Cassius fled. Rome belonged to Antony. But he wasn't the only one with a claim to power. A young man arrived in Rome, demanding his place, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. At first, Antony dismissed him. He was just a boy, barely 20, with no military experience. But Octavian was shrewder than anyone expected. He gained the Senate support and raised his own army. Now, Antony had a rival. What followed was a deadly political chess game. Antony, Octavian, and another powerful general, Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, an uneasy alliance to hunt down Caesar's assassins. Their enemies were crushed at the Battle of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius both dying on the battlefield. But victory came at a cost. The alliance was crumbling. Lepidus was sidelined, leaving only Antony and Octavian. To secure his position, Antony made a fateful move. He went to Egypt.
And there, he met Cleopatra.
Their connection was instant, electric. She was more than just a queen. She was a force of nature, brilliant, ambitious, and just as politically savvy as Antony. He needed her wealth and military support, and she needed his power in Rome. But their partnership quickly became something more. Rome watched in shock as Antony, once a Roman hero, began adopting Egyptian customs, dressing in Eastern fashion, and spending more time in Alexandria than in Rome. Octavian seized the moment. He launched a propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a traitor, seduced and controlled by Cleopatra. The Senate turned against him. War was inevitable. The final showdown came at Actium in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra's navy faced off against Octavian's forces. It was supposed to be a battle of equals, but Antony's fleet was outmaneuvered. When Cleopatra's ships retreated, Antony followed, a move that would haunt him forever.
His forces crumbled.
Rome had chosen its victor. Defeated, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. The dream of ruling together was shattered. Octavian's army closed in, and Antony, realizing there was no escape, chose to die on his own terms. He fell on his sword, bleeding out in Cleopatra's arms. Days later, she followed him, choosing death over capture. Rome belonged to Octavian, who would soon become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But Antony's story didn't end with his death. His name, his legend, and his love for Cleopatra would be remembered for centuries. The question remains, was Antony a victim of fate, or his own worst enemy? The war for Rome's future had reached its breaking point. Mark Antony, once the powerful general and closest ally of Julius Caesar, now stood on the edge of ruin. His forces were dwindling, his alliances were fracturing, and Octavian, the rising power of Rome, was closing in. But Antony wasn't ready to surrender.
Not yet.
He and Cleopatra made their final stand at Actium. Antony commanded a massive fleet, but something was wrong. His soldiers were exhausted, his ships were outmatched, and worst of all, doubt had crept into his ranks. Octavian's forces, led by the brilliant General Agrippa, had cut off their supply lines, slowly strangling them. Antony's once mighty army was starving, their morale crumbling. The battle began with fire and steel. Antony's warships, larger and more heavily armed, crashed into Octavian's fleet. For a moment, it seemed like he could win.
But then, everything changed.
Cleopatra's fleet, stationed at the rear, suddenly turned and fled.
No signal, no warning, just retreat.
Panic spread through Antony's ranks. His men hesitated, unsure whether to fight or follow. And in that instant, the battle was lost. Antony, torn between fury and despair, made a split-second decision. He chased after Cleopatra. The world saw it as a betrayal of his army, an unforgivable act of weakness. But Antony didn't care. He had already lost Rome. All that remained was Egypt and her. Back in Alexandria, reality set in. His forces were shattered, his allies abandoned him, and Octavian's army was marching toward the city. Antony tried to rally what little strength he had left, preparing for one last fight. But his own men, the soldiers who had once followed him without question, refused to obey. They surrendered without lifting a sword.
The war was over.
Rumors reached Antony's ears. Cleopatra had betrayed him. That she had already negotiated with Octavian.
That she was dead.
Heartbroken, he did what so many great warriors had done before him.
He fell on his sword.
But even in death, fate played one last trick.
The wound was deep, but not fatal.
He lingered, bleeding, suffering. And then, another shock, Cleopatra was alive. She had never betrayed him. The rumors were lies. He was carried to her chambers weak and dying. In his final moments, she held him close, whispering words that history would never record. He had lost Rome, lost the war, but in that moment, all that mattered was her.
Then, with one last breath, he was gone.
Cleopatra knew what would come next. Octavian would arrive soon, and she would not be his prisoner. Days later, she too chose death, allowing herself to be bitten by a venomous asp. The lovers, whose passion had defied empires, were finally together in death. Octavian marched into Alexandria, victorious. Antony's name was erased from history, his statues torn down, his legacy smeared. But Rome could never truly forget him. His legend lived on, in whispers, in stories, in the undying tale of love and war that would be told for centuries. Was Antony a tragic hero, undone by his own passion? Or was he a man who, in the end, chose love over power? The world would never stop debating his fate. Antony's world had collapsed. His armies were gone, his allies had deserted him, and the mighty Rome he had once fought for now saw him as a traitor. Trapped in Alexandria, he was no longer the fearsome general who had commanded legions, but a man stripped of power, clinging to whatever remained. Cleopatra tried to reassure him, promising they could still find a way out, but even she knew the truth. Octavian would never let them escape. Every day, reports arrived of Octavian's forces drawing closer. Antony, once full of fire and defiance, now moved like a man already half dead. His soldiers, the ones who had remained loyal to him despite everything, began surrendering in waves. His fleet, the last hope of resistance, turned against him without a fight. The war had been lost at Actium, but now, the final betrayal was complete. Then came the news that shattered him completely. Cleopatra was dead. The woman he had fought for, the queen he had loved beyond reason, had taken her own life rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome as a conquered queen. Antony, already broken, saw no future beyond this moment. His last act would be his own choosing. With the sword that had once led him to victory, he turned the blade on himself. It was supposed to be quick, but fate was cruel.
The wound was deep, but not fatal.
As his vision blurred, his men rushed to his side, trying to stop the bleeding, but Antony had no interest in surviving. He had lost everything, his army, his honor, and now Cleopatra.
Then, another twist.
A whisper through the palace: Cleopatra was alive. The reports had been false. Hope flickered for only a second before reality returned. Whether she lived or not, there was no escape. He was dying, and she would not be far behind. They carried him to her, his blood staining the palace walls as they moved. When he saw her, his face twisted in pain, not just from the wound, but from the cruel irony of it all. She held him, her arms wrapping around the man who had once commanded the world, now reduced to a dying warrior. Whatever was said between them in those final moments was lost to history. No grand speeches, no declarations of love fit for legend. Just a whispered farewell, a final touch, and then, silence. Antony was gone. The man who had once stood beside Julius Caesar, who had fought and won battles across the world, who had nearly claimed Rome for himself, had died not on the battlefield, but in the arms of his lover. Cleopatra was left with a choice. She could surrender, throw herself at Octavian's mercy, live as a prisoner in Rome, an exotic trophy for the man who had taken everything from her. Or she could write her own ending. She chose the latter. Days later, as Octavian's forces moved through the palace, they found her lifeless body. Whether the ASP, that fabled serpent of Egyptian legend, truly delivered the fatal bite, or whether poison was her true escape, no one could say for certain. But the result was the same. With her death, Egypt fell. Octavian marched through the city, victorious, knowing he had ended not just a war, but an era. Antony and Cleopatra were gone, their love story sealed in tragedy, their names forever entwined. Rome erased Antony from its history. His statues were torn down, his legacy rewritten. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, ruled as the first emperor of Rome. The world Antony had fought for, the ideals he had believed in, were reshaped under new rule. His name became a cautionary tale, a man who had everything, only to lose it all for love. But love, history would remember. And long after Rome had turned to dust, the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra would still be whispered, still be told, a romance and a downfall too great to be forgotten. Mark Antony was gone, but his shadow stretched far beyond his death. His name was spoken in whispers, his legend woven into history, not just as a warrior or a politician, but as a man consumed by love, ambition, and fate. Rome tried to erase him. Statues were toppled, records rewritten, and Octavian, now Augustus, made sure Antony's memory was stained with failure. But history is never so easily controlled. For those who had once followed him, Antony was still the brilliant general, the man who had stood beside Julius Caesar, who had conquered lands, who had held the fate of Rome in his hands. He had fought with unmatched ferocity, commanded legions that had reshaped empires, and for a time, he had been unstoppable. His soldiers, the ones who had bled beside him, would not forget the man he was before the fall. But Rome told a different story. To the new empire, Antony was the man who threw it all away, not for glory, not for conquest, but for Cleopatra. His name became a warning, a lesson in how love could destroy even the strongest of men. They painted him as weak, controlled by a foreign queen, lost in indulgence, while Octavian, the true heir of Rome, brought order and strength. Yet, time has a way of reshaping narratives. Cleopatra was not just a seductress, and Antony was not just a man who fell for her charms. Together, they had built something powerful, an alliance that threatened Rome itself, a vision of a world ruled not by a single empire but by a fusion of East and West. Had they won, history would have been rewritten, and perhaps Antony would have been seen not as a tragic figure but as a visionary. Even in failure, he left his mark. The war between him and Octavian changed Rome forever. It was the final nail in the coffin of the Republic. With Antony gone, Octavian was free to reshape Rome into an empire with himself as the sole ruler. The age of emperors began, and in some ways, Antony's defeat paved the way for the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. In literature, in theater, in art, Antony lived on. Shakespeare immortalized him in Antony and Cleopatra, turning his story into one of the greatest tragedies ever written. Painters, poets, and historians returned to his tale again and again, fascinated by the man who had stood at the height of power and lost it all, not in battle, but in love. His legacy became more than just the man Rome tried to erase. It became a symbol of passion, of ambition, and of the thin line between greatness and downfall. Rome endured, but so did Antony's story. Centuries later, people still ask, was he a hero betrayed by fate? Or was he the architect of his own ruin? The debate never ends, because Antony was never just one thing. He was a warrior and a lover, a leader and a man lost in his desires. He was both the victor and the defeated. And perhaps that is why history has never been able to forget him. The story of Mark Antony is one of power, ambition, and love that burned too brightly to last. He was a man who stood at the center of Rome's greatest turning point, a warrior who fought for his place in history, only to be undone by the very passions that made him unforgettable. He could have been Rome's ruler. He had the loyalty of its greatest legions, the experience of war, and the name that once stood alongside Julius Caesar's. But fate, or perhaps his own choices, led him down a different path. A path that took him away from Rome, into the arms of Cleopatra, into the heart of Egypt, where he believed he could build something greater than the world had ever seen. But Rome does not forgive. Octavian was relentless, and Antony's mistakes became his downfall. He bet everything on love, on war, on the belief that he could defy the tides of history, and he lost. Not just his power, not just his armies, but his very place in the world. His end was not on the battlefield, but in the quiet tragedy of a man realizing he had been outplayed, that his era was over, that the dream he fought for had slipped through his fingers. And yet, he is remembered. Not just as a failed conqueror, not just as a man who lost to Octavian, but as something more. His name is tied to passion, to grand ambitions, to a love that defied an empire. Antony was not forgotten, nor was Cleopatra. Together, they became legend. Their story centuries later still echoes, told and retold, studied and debated. Was he a hero or a man blinded by his own desires? Was he a great leader who could have changed history or a cautionary tale of power lost to love? That is the question left behind, the mystery that makes him endure. And in the end, perhaps that is Antony's true legacy. Not the battles he won or lost, not the empire he failed to claim, but the fact that even in defeat, he remains unforgettable.